Welcome, everyone, to another edition of SCRC's Let's Talk Caregiving. I'm your host, Roberto Velasquez, President and CEO of Southern Caregiver Resource Center. And I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Martha Rañón, our Executive Vice President. Hi, Martha. How are you doing today?
Hey, Roberto. I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm so happy today. We have a very special guest. Her name is Deborah Ferrell. And Deborah is the Director of Care Services for the ALS Association in San Diego. Deborah spent 35 years in social services, dedicating her career to supporting individuals and communities in needs. And she also has a very rich background in hospice care as well. We're really happy that you're here, Deborah. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Roberto and Martha, for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
It is our pleasure to have you here. And I wanted to see if we can start a little bit by you defining what ALS is.
Interesting. You hear often in our community, I think I've heard that. Isn't that Lou Gehrig's disease thing? But a lot of people really don't know what it means or entails. So a little bit about ALS and why I love doing what I do. It's a progressive terminal disease. 90% of people diagnosed with ALS, it's sporadic, meaning it's a disease that we just don't know why somebody gets this disease. 10% is genetic or family history. So there's a gene mutation associated with their diagnosis. And so they're aware that there's a possibility they could have it. ALS is a motor neuron disease. So kind of think of it like the brain stops talking to the muscles and the tissues in the body, which then starts to affect your ability to talk, eat, walk, breathe, and ultimately you pass. So there is not a specific age range. It used to be 60, typically men and women. Now we're seeing younger. So age 50, it's not uncommon to have younger than 50. There's a higher incidence of those in the military, which I really want to specify here. I think it's critical. Our armed, forces and those serving our country tend to have a higher rate of this diagnosis. One of the things that's really discouraging, but starting to get better, is that most people with this diagnosis take quite some time to get diagnosed, and the lifespan is 2 to 5 years. So if you're having symptoms for 3 years and you're not diagnosed to your 4th year, then quality of life and the treatment and the services that you could have had prior have been delayed. So we really want to start making awareness.
So Deborah, when you talk about diagnosis and symptoms of ALS, it's interesting, though, that it starts very mild, right? With symptoms of like hand and maybe some motor movement problems and things of that nature. And I mean, to me, that is a pretty serious thing to not like pick up and say, I need to go see a doctor. Do you ever get feedback from individuals with ALS or caregivers who say why they didn't go right away to get checked out?
So actually, maybe let me clarify. So they did go, the doctors weren't able to make the diagnoses. And so some people will have an onset of limb onset, their hands, some it's slurred speech. They think they're having a stroke. Some it's just their legs. And so it just depends. And so does progression. I hear a lot of stories of people saying that it took a year or two before they were diagnosed with this disease. And that's unfortunate.
So, Debbie, what would be then the signs to look out for if you are suspecting that something's amiss?
So we talk about this a lot in the ALS community. Everybody's prognosis, diagnosis, and how their journey is different. However, there are certain things, maybe a loss of hand writing. All of a sudden, they can't hold a pen. Shaking, inability to raise your hand, slurred speech, tripping over your leg when you're at a party and you just fall. Trying to think of other things that could happen. There's so many.
Are they mostly physical?
They're mostly physical, although I think most of those people are going through something emotional because they know something's not right at that time. So yes, and yes. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that once it's there's no cure, of course, and there are a couple of medications that help with some of the symptoms of the illness. But I do know that after some time, many people will develop some cognitive impairment as well. So, maybe some even with frontal temporal lobe dementia. And so it does become very serious. In fact, the person actually might even lose the ability to swallow and eat later on with the symptoms, and it becomes very difficult, maybe even to speak. But doesn't mean they can't communicate, but it just their speech is impaired. And so there's a lot of more progressive symptoms that develop with this illness especially because it's progressive and there is no cure for it.
So, Debbie, I'm wondering if I'm sure there are stages of the progression and, the beginning, the middle, towards the end. What should a caregiver do when there is a first, initial indication and maybe the doctor, like you said earlier, does not know, might not have an idea what's going on. As a caregiver, you know the person so much better. You live with that person perhaps. And you're trying to figure out, is this okay? Is this normal? Is this a regular part of aging? What is it that caregivers can do at the beginning to figure out maybe it's something more and to advocate for those individuals?
right. So to just quickly to respond to Robert, there's multiple forms. Bulbar, where people can lose their speech, limb onset, different types of onset, and it is progressive. And I think it's really important that you keep saying there is no cure. There is no cure, but we want this to be a livable disease. So I think that's a really critical point. Moving over to you, Martha. Caregivers, I believe, when you want to know something about a patient, you go to the caregiver. They will typically often know more than the family member. So when I worked hospice, I used to say to the team, if you really want to know how the patient's doing as far as progression, talk to the home health aide. They know everything. It's an intimate job on various levels, but they're the ones working with them. So to answer your question, I think advocacy. Caregivers know their
Mm-hmm.
patients. If they notice something isn't going on, back to the PCP, their hands are shaking. All of a sudden, the last 3 weeks, the speech is slurred. I think we really need to investigate this. Is this normal? Is it normal progression of disease, or could something else be going on?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think one of the things that we always preach to family caregivers, and when our family consultants are working with individual family members who are caregivers, whether it be Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, or in the few cases that we have had over the years of ALS, it's doing a lot of education and connecting them right away to care planning, creating your advanced directives, making sure that you have a durable power of attorney for health for when that individual is not able to make those decisions, especially in such a quick disease. You said the average age could be, lifespan could be 3 to 5 years, maybe a little longer, but that's way different than somebody with Alzheimer's who could live, 20 years with the disease. So I think that's a really important piece as far as connecting the caregiver to those types of resources, as well as with the physician. And there's usually a big team, right? There's physical therapists, there's occupational therapists. As the disease progresses, there's other professionals that become part of the care team, including the family caregiver.
Debbie, I wanted to see if you can give us an idea of, and of course, I'm looking at it from the perspective of the caregiver because that's what we do here in trying to support those individuals who are caring for someone with ALS. As the disease progresses, what can they expect, and how can they manage those changes?
Those are really great questions. Firstly, I just wanted to answer there is a component with ALS and FTD. And in the world of caregiving, there are a lot of caregivers that are taking care of people with dementia and FTD. So we do see a higher incidence in that with people who have a genetic component and then an FTD component. For caregivers who are taking care of a loved one with ALS or, just assigned to someone with ALS, the progression's different for everyone. I think, breathing issues can arise, bedbound issues. So you're looking at the possibility maybe of wounds, change in body shape, which requires different equipment. There are multiple resources for caregivers through our organization. We actually, when we do an intake with someone, we send a list of caregiving information because taking care of someone with ALS is a different beast in many ways, because you're dealing with a progression that you don't know. One day they could be breathing fine, the next day not. What to look for? What does that look like?
Yeah, and I would imagine that for the caregiver, then this emotional roller coaster that they start to get on once their loved one is diagnosed with ALS and the progression starts to occur, is pretty severe. I mean, you're dealing with ambiguous loss, you're dealing with anticipatory grief. I mean, other kinds of emotional challenges because while you're the caregiver and this might be your spouse, let's say it is your spouse, that person's there but not there, or what the outcome's going to be. And so it does, you do need outlets for yourself as a caregiver, a support group, maybe counseling, or at minimum, at least somebody to talk to one-on-one. I know, Martha, you talk about when you were a caregiver, how you needed to have somebody just to talk to about the issues and not try to problem solve for you, but just so you can, air out
Absolutely.
your emotions, your griefs and stuff.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right. And to speak to that, a caregiver who knows that their loved one has been given a prognosis and a diagnosis of a lifespan of 2 to 5 years, caring for them, having their own grief, needing the time to take a break from being a caregiver, which is not only physical demanding, it's emotionally demanding. It's critical that there are resources out there for our caregivers. I think they're the most overlooked and underutilized in a capacity of a support group where they can step into others that are doing the same thing as them and getting support that way. So counseling can be critical. Coming to the ALS Association, I am the biggest anticipatory planner in the world. So I'm always get your ducks in a row, do that, but also for caregivers. I also think that there's a really big arena where caregivers get lost in death. So when someone passes and they've been caregiving for them for a while, what does that look like, right? So you have your anticipatory grief of what's coming and then the grief when they pass. And that's also something that in skilled nursing facilities, boarding cares, personal homes, the caregivers are just overlooked. They do most of the work. And then when someone passes, they're kind of left in this separate little world, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. I mean, that happens a lot with caregivers, and I imagine it's even, like you said, it's such a short period of time frame, unfortunately, when you have ALS, once you've been diagnosed and then, to the end of life, that it happens so quickly. It's all compact into a few years, which is really heartbreaking. And I know that for caregivers, we often preach at Southern Caregiver Resource Center. Again, we teach them, and Martha's really good at this with her team and doing the education on how to self-care. Don't put your own care and health aside. You have to be able to take care of yourself as you're dealing with the changes for your loved one. Physical exercise, prayer, meditation, relaxation exercises. Again, we talked about support groups and talking to others, friends and family and things of that nature are incredibly important.
Extremely important. Like I said, talking to friends, taking a day off, walking on the beach, going to your church if that's where you find your people, taking a break. The best type of caregiver is a caregiver that takes care of themselves. And that is true for all of us in any capacity where we work and what we do on a daily basis. We can't serve others if we're not serving ourselves. I'm always educating, encouraging, feed yourself, nourish yourself emotionally, physically. Some people love to meditate, some people hate. Some people love to go to support groups and find comfort in that. Other people's hate it. I always educate. It doesn't matter what you do as long as you're doing your way.
Absolutely. And I also, speaking of education, I also want to make sure that people find their own time to really inform themselves through education, through asking questions, through resources, right? If you suspect that there's something, not a regular behavior, or that something is different, and asking the questions of the doctors, asking the questions of these organizations, what is ALS, right? Like how I started off asking at the beginning, what is FTD, frontal temporal dementia, right? And what does that look like? What does that entail? How would it progress? Because as caregivers, and I hope that people out there really take this information and apply it to themselves, it's really, like you said earlier, every person is different. And our reactions to those changes are different. Our abilities to adapt are different. So, really informing yourself, what does it look like? What treatment options are out there? What medication can slow down some of the symptoms? Yes, for a lot of these cognitive, dementias or progressive diseases, there is no cure, but it is about management. It is about, kind of acquiring as much information as possible.
And typically, what we often see is that those people who have ALS and FTD, the FTD is progressing even faster than the ALS. So, as a caregiver dealing with a cognitive deficit, a physical deficit, and an emotional deficit in their loved one, and then in themselves emotionally and possibly physically, because taking care of a loved one with ALS is very difficult to do for various reasons. I think it's critical to be able to identify how you re-nourish yourself.
Well, and I know we're almost out of time for this segment of our podcast, but I did also want to bring up another topic related to ALS and the type of disease that it is, because it also affects young adults, not just your elderly, like Alzheimer's, which is primarily, people over the age of 60 and 70 years old or 80 years old. You're talking about people maybe in their 40s or 50s with young children, young adolescents, or even college kids. And I think that that's something to keep in mind, because the kids become caregivers themselves, and we need to pay attention to their needs as well. I do know, just talking with other researchers, that we estimate that about 25% of college students are caregivers to some respect within their families, 25%. And they might not be the primary, but they're doing caregiving. And that's the same thing, with young adolescents at home. Maybe they're helping watch dad while mom goes gets things. So it's really important to take that into consideration. And also the ability to access respite services for the family caregiver. At Southern Caregiver Resource Center, we have these respite services. In fact, we have really uh, robust respite programs that allow families to take that break from caregiving. And so, again, I encourage people to connect with us, connect with ALS Association, and really just grab all the resources you can. The more you have, the more you know, the more power you have, and the better caregiver you can be.
So first, thank you for having me and allowing me to have this platform to really talk about ALS. I could talk for hours in specifics about what this disease is. If we leave with anything today, please know it affects the military more. Yes, This is a disease that is terminal, but we want to be hopeful and focus on it being livable with all the new science and research out there. And most importantly, you guys. If we don't have resources for our caregivers to turn to, things get even more complicated. So you have the biggest job of all. And so we thank you. We'll continue to educate and support our caregivers. Like I said, everybody deals with things differently, and we want to make sure that we're supporting them as well, and work together to do that for our community, the ALS community, the San Diego community, and your organization that does great work.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Debbie.
Well, that's all the time we have left for this edition of Let's Talk Caregiving. To hear more of our podcasts, follow us on your favorite podcasting platform or visit our website at scrc.care. I want to thank Martha for co-hosting another important discussion, Deborah for sharing her background and caregiver stories with us, and our audience for tuning in. If you're providing support to a loved one, you don't have to do this alone. Asking for help is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. To connect to our programs and services, visit our website at scrc.care or call us at 1-800-827-1008. If you live outside of San Diego and Imperial counties, visit caregivercalifornia.org and connect with the Caregiver Resource Center nearest you. To support our efforts and make a tax-deductible donation, please go to scrc.care and click on the Donate tab. And remember, SCRC is here for you, caring for those who care for others.